I would like to introduce Professor Yefremian. Professor Andre Yefremian has been an adjunct faculty member in the Department of Anthropology at Glendale Community College since 2006. He earned a MA, master's degree in anthropology from Cal State Fullerton. That has a very good college program, by the way. And it has a BS in biology, wow, and a BA in German literature from the University of California at Riverside. It's a great university, as we are very familiar. Professor Yefremian has taught several grade levels and subject matter at various institutions, including courses in archaeology, cultural anthropology, biological anthropology, and women's studies. In addition to his teaching duties, Professor Yefremian is an executive board member of the Southwestern Anthropological Association. Wow. Trained in cultural anthropology, Professor Yefremian has a research interest in national and ethnic identity construction, sustainability, perceptions of a medical practice and health, globalization, and geographic emphasis on the European Union. So I'd like to proudly present you, Professor Andre.
Well, welcome everyone this afternoon to my lecture presentation on clarifying the concept of race. Okay. I am an anthropologist, okay, and that doesn't signify or mean that we study dinosaurs. I'd like to get that out of the way. We study humans and our ancestors, our hominin ancestors. Okay, so that's the scope of my specialty here. And this presentation will focus on both the biological and also cultural aspects of being human. Okay. So you guys have a good view here while I'm standing here? All right. Human bottleneck, perception of race. Now, here's the content that I will cover in the following order. Race, historical thoughts. I might as well give you a brief overview of how human variation was perceived in the past to bring us up to this contemporary time period. And then we will journey together on human origins. So we're studying our origins. We'll take a look at where we came from, okay? And last but not least, our current diversity, how we vary, in comparison to one another. Okay. First, a bit of terminology that I need to get out of the way so that we're all on the same page as far as defining things go. Some of you may have already seen these terms with a cultural anthropology course or sociology course or even ethnic studies course that you have taken. So, race. Now there's two definitions of race. Okay? One is the biological one. It means subspecies, okay? But it is a genetically distinct interbreeding population of a single species. So within a species, you have different subspecies. So subspecies and race are interchangeable terms within the field of biology. Okay? There's also a sociological definition of race. Okay? It is the way that people describe and organize human diversity. So in this case, you're not relying on biology to define people, it's just your perception of categorizing people the way you see fit. Okay? The term ethnicity, okay? I might as well clarify that alongside race. Ethnicity is simply a socially defined category of people who identify with each other and share a common language, ancestry, customs, traditions, beliefs, history, and or national experience. So a cultural group, a group of people, an identifiable group of people. Okay. So both race and ethnicity, you see there is a difference. One of them has a biological definition, which focuses on physical characteristics, genetics, and so on, in other words. Okay. What I'm about to show you, and I don't mean to spoil the surprise, is that for humans, the biological concept of race does not exist. We have the sociological phenomenon of race. So both race and ethnicity, as far as the human context goes, is one of the same. They're just categories of describing or making sense of human diversity. Okay? And every culture has a different way of categorizing the people that they see around them. Okay? So there's no consistency there as far as classification goes. Okay? So that's just to give you an overview of what we're up against. So there's no biological reality of race for humans. Historical perspectives of race, or the historical thought process. I can go back further in history to ancient Greek times where they made an attempt at just categorizing peoples. However, I will start with Carl von Linné, otherwise known as Carolus Linnaeus, his Latin name. It was fashionable during the 1700s to have your name in Latin. Yeah. So Carl von Linné is his real name, a botanist and I would say natural philosopher from Sweden. I'm choosing him because he is after the discovery period. Columbus had already set on the Americas, okay, and that introduced the world to new species of plants and animals and even humans to start the classification process. So Linnaeus is famous for classifying plants, animals, humans, and so on, okay, a naming system. So when we look at Linnaeus, he classified modern humans into 5 different groups. Okay. We have Homo sapiens Afar, which are the Africans. Okay. Now notice the 3 names, Homo sapiens Afar. Okay. Those biologists out there will know that Homo is the genus name, and then the second part is the species name, and then the third position would be the subspecies, okay, which is synonymous with race, essentially. So he defined humanity into subspecies, 5 subspecies. Okay? That's just to make note here of his attempt at just trying to classify. Okay? Homo sapiens americanus, that would be the Native Americans. Homo sapiens asiaticus, that is the Asian population. Homo sapiens europaeus, the Europeans, and Homo sapiens feris, wild men. This was probably a category that he didn't know much about, so he lumped everything else together, just called them wild men. Okay. Again, science tries to study things, and then future generations build on what the previous generation did. So this was, to his credit, an attempt just to get things out there, to get things named. Okay. Okay, going up there again, or an update from Linnaeus, Friedrich Blumenbach, okay, divided humanity into 5 races, like Linnaeus did, but had different names for them. Okay, you had the Caucasian, first time here that the term was used, named after the Caucasus Mountains in the southern part of Russia, between the Caspian and Black Sea. For him, it was the specimens classified as Caucasian or European should be Caucasian because the best specimens existed there according to him. So Caucasian, Mongolian, that would represent the Asians, Ethiopian, the Africans, American, that's referring to the Native Americans, and Malayan, which would be around the South Pacific area. Okay. So when we look at behind me, those 5 peoples, the one on the bottom to your right would be Malayan, for example.
Sorry, Andre?
Okay, so this was around the 1800s, and Blumenbach is just one of many representative of this era. What happened during Blumenbach's time and a little bit afterwards were careful measurements were being taken of skulls and body parts, recording that kind of data in order to analyze them and try and determine human differences out of the patterns that they see. So a lot of data was collected in this manner and analyzed, trying to bring credence to the concept of race. Okay. William Ripley was one such scientist who did careful measurements on skulls.
To his credit, he was an economist and built up a lot of wealth for himself in the railroad industry. So on his spare time, he pursued his passion, which was being a racial theorist. Okay? He's famous for his tripartite racial theory of Europe, dividing Europe into 3 subspecies, essentially. The Teutonic, which would be on the top photo. This is the type that is found most characteristically in Northern Europe, the tall, blonde hair, blue-eyed, fair skin. He classified another variation of Europeans called the Alpine, which is along central France, Switzerland, and into the Czech Republic. Basically, these people were relatively stocky, okay, darker pigmentation, and a much rounder skull. And then you had the Mediterranean type, which, like the Nordic, had a longer skull from top to bottom. It measured much longer than it did on the width area. But the pigmentation was darker and the stature was shorter. Now these are just glossing over the different traits. However, looking back on this kind of data, okay, you can find all 3 types anywhere in Europe. Okay? It's not that these tribes have demarcated lines where you only find the Nordic type or the Teutonic type in one area, and in another area just the Alpine type, and then the Mediterranean type, which stretches from Portugal to northern India. Okay? There is, all 3 types exist everywhere between Great Britain all the way down to northern India. Okay? So this is not distinctive, but to Ripley's credit, someone had to gather this data, someone had to establish something in order to set the stage for other scientists. Okay? And that's where we enter Franz Boas. Now he is the father of American anthropology. Okay? So just a little over 100 years ago, anthropology was established as a discipline here in the United States. Okay? Now, what Franz Boas was criticize Ripley and the contemporaries at the time for doing anthropometric measurements or craniometric measurements, meaning careful measurements of the skull and other body parts. And he saw their data and he says, look, there's just way too much overlap, there are no distinctive lines drawn. One is just trying to search for a way to categorize humans, but the reality doesn't reveal that. Boas added to the already current data at the time and concluded that the differences within a population group was greater than the differences between the populations. That means, for example, 2 people randomly selected from the African population have more genetic differences between each other than you compare the entire African population with, let's say, the entire European population, because the genes are overlapping. Okay? And I might as well make note here is that if you want to find the greatest difference within humanity, it's not between population groups, it's between sexes. That's the greatest amount of genetic diversity that you will find, or genetic difference, I should say. Okay? So male and female, they have the greatest genetic difference, not one member of the African population and one member of the Asian population. That is not so much a genetic difference as far as the sexes go. Okay? So Franz Boas set the stage for American anthropology as we know it. Ashley Montague, however, just updated but didn't contradict Franz Boas. Okay. So Ashley Montague argued that this scientific notion of race doesn't exist. The data doesn't hold so that there are distinct populations. Okay. Data has been reviewed, added on, and he says that a better way to classify humanity would be towards ethnic groups. We have different cultural groups. So humans do exist in different interbreeding populations, which is true, but that doesn't signify race. That doesn't signify the biological definition of race, where you have a distinct population group. There are no distinct population groups among humans. Okay. So that's a bit of an overview of the historical thought process on race. Many scientists have tried to collect data. Some scientists wanted there to be the concept of race, because they use it as a political instrument to subdue other peoples. It's to legitimize slavery, for instance. There's nothing inherent about the Africans being used as slaves, because slavery was colorblind in the era. The Vikings were using Celts as slaves, and they weren't much different from each other, genetically speaking. The Egyptians used whoever they could as slaves, okay? And in Mongolia, the Mongolians used the Chinese as slaves throughout the history. So slavery was colorblind. You just needed an excuse to enslave someone, and that was it. There was nothing inherent about certain people having a role as simply just slaves. So politics behind the race concept played a huge role in trying to make race something legitimate, okay? So there's a lot of political power behind pushing race forward as a concept to, use against a certain group of people, okay? Now what I'm going to do is go through the human journey as it actually is, using updated information within anthropology, but also genetics. Genetics is like the new data set that is used to basically figure out what human variation is about. Okay? So a brief overview of human origins as it currently stands. Okay? Keep in mind that the human family tree is always being updated. Okay? So this is the current view of it. Now, when we look at the bottom of the tree, 6-7 million years ago, we have a group called the Ardipithecus group. There were several species within that group. Some scientists argue there really weren't that many species, it was just variation of the same species. Again, there's a little bit of politics there, because you only get famous if you discover a new species. So sometimes scientists try hard to make believe that, yeah, I did discover a new species, it's different from that previous one, but it's probably all one species. But because the sample size is so small, it's a little bit of a gray area to draw conclusions. Okay, just to point that out. Yeah. When we go up the tree, we see an Australopithecus group, okay, going back 3 to 4 million years. Okay. If you maybe recall, there was a movie out a few years ago starring Scarlett Johansson called Lucy. Yeah. And within the movie, there was a point where Johansson's character, Lucy, was meeting the Lucy of prehistory. Okay? Lucy is within the Australopithecus group. Okay? As you can see, the Australopithecus group doesn't produce anything above it. It's a dead-end branch, just like the Ardipithecus group. Okay? So it's, in this human family tree, what you have is a lot of human-like creatures dying out. Okay? Not everything, or not every single species has a descendant. So moving up the tree, we have a Paranthropus group, also dead-end. Okay? That's about 2-3 million years ago. And then finally, higher up on the tree, the Homo group, okay? Which includes us, way at the top. Okay? So that's a bit of history here. This all occurred in Africa. However, when you reach the Homo group, there were migrations going outside of Africa. Okay? Okay, so the recent origins of modern humans, I reveal that it goes back about 7 million years, when you can say we had something like resembling humans. Hominin means that it resembles humans. They walk on 2 legs. So we use that as a determining category, whether we consider something a hominin or not. So walking on 2 legs goes back 7 million years. The recent origins of modern humans goes back to Africa with a specimen called Homo heidelbergensis. Okay? They did go from Africa to Europe as well. Okay? And Homo heidelbergensis, as you can see, it's to the left of, from your perspective, and also on the bottom. There's another picture of a dark-skinned heidelbergensis. Okay? So you see, there's no exact science behind going from a skull to flesh. There's going to be some variation as far as how to put the flesh on, in other words. Okay? So heidelbergensis gave rise to Homo neanderthalensis, which is in the center. okay, in Europe. Neanderthals were contemporaries to modern humans, except they died out just 25,000 years ago. Okay? Homo heidelbergensis that remained in Africa gave rise to Homo sapiens sapiens, which is the name for modern humans. Okay? So Neanderthals did not give rise to modern humans. They existed at the same time. Just one was in Europe, the other one was in Africa until the migration happened. Okay? And to your far right, you can see the label Cro-Magnon on there for modern humans. Cro-Magnon is just one of many modern humans. Cro-Magnon, in this case, was just the specimens that arrived in present-day France. Okay? So humanity had various lineages. Neanderthals was parallel to ourselves until it became extinct 25,000 years ago. And we're the last remaining hominin so far. Okay? A bit of a lesson on concepts before moving further down the line of what happened to modern humans and their migration out of Africa. Okay? So the bottleneck concept, as I have also written in the title of today's lecture. Let me explain the concept here. Okay, you have a former population, and the little shapes in different colors represent diversity, let's say. Okay? In the middle, which is called the bottleneck, you have a narrowing. Okay? There could be a major environmental disaster that decimates the population, causing the numbers to go way down, and also the diversity to also go down. But you can achieve the population back up after the major environmental disaster has ended. Okay? So the population does go back up, which is labeled new population, but you see the diversity is not there. The numbers are there, but not the diversity. Okay, so that's the bottlenecking phenomena. And this has happened within our evolutionary history as well. Okay, human migrations now. So, the current modern humans goes back around 200,000 years ago, directly derived from Homo heidelbergensis of Africa. Okay. So for 200,000 years, modern humans have been cultivated in Africa, in tropical climate. Okay. And what is advantageous in a tropical climate is to be tall and thin, in order to dissipate the heat. Okay? And also, it is conceivable to assume that our ancestors going back that far were also dark-skinned, okay? Which I will get into later as far as the advantages of that is, basically to keep out excess sunlight, but it's more deeper than that. Okay? So for 200,000 years, our direct ancestors, which were modern humans, just like us, physically speaking, they were cultivated in the eastern part of Africa. Up until 50 or 70,000 years ago, some event happened. A huge climate change. Severe drought in Africa. Okay? So what that drought did was eliminate large numbers of the population. The human population was dwindling to very critical levels of becoming virtually extinct. What happened is human ingenuity took over. There were some members of humanity during that time which, again, they had survival instincts. They wanted to survive. They thought and planned ahead. They thought if they followed animals, it would lead them to water. Okay? And this is all gained through experience. These were hunters. Okay? They were hunters and gatherers at the time. So one basically observes the world around them, tries to make sense of it, and they see patterns, that animals tend to find water, so if they would follow the animals, they can get to the water. Other thought processes that have occurred at that time period, which likely helped their survival, was trying to understand the future. If they can imagine themselves thirsty in the future, they can do something about it now so they don't suffer later. Those that had the ability for foresight, we take it for granted today, but at that time, foresight would help you survive. you can put a picture in your mind that I will store water in a container for later use. You have to kind of speak to yourself, put a picture in your mind, an image. So imagination is what saved humanity. And those that couldn't imagine, those that did not have foresight, those that could not plan ahead, did perish. So what you had is modern humans at that time period, which were identical to their ancestors 200,000 years ago and physically identical to us today. But something happened between 50 and 70,000 years ago that changed, that made them different from previous modern humans. This increased proportion of people with imagination, okay, saved humanity, and the numbers of humanity went back up instead of becoming extinct. Okay? So imagination is what saved humanity, and it is that brain that went outside of Africa, populating the rest of the world. Okay? So that is the essence of humanity, is to be able to imagine it. Being able to imagine a world better than the current one that you're living in. Okay? Imagination is that excellent tool that helps you plan to think abstract concepts and so on. It all originated in that sense of trying to figure out a way out of this drought or how to cope with it. Okay? And with those imaginative people, why stay in one place or one region? They would follow the animals wherever they led to, because following the animals would be a consistent supply of food to hunt, right? And they would follow them outside of East Africa, to the Middle East, and beyond, okay? Because there was no fear, again, of traveling. They had confidence to travel out. They had confidence in their tool-making abilities at that time, that they can make tools anywhere that they go, okay? So, in East Africa, humanity, or some members, not all of humanity traveled out of Africa, some remained, traveled from East Africa along the Middle East onto India, which you see there marked on the map, to Southeast Asia and into Australia. That was one of the first permanent migrations. Okay? So from Africa all the way to Australia, around 50,000 years ago. Today, the Australian natives, okay, are the oldest continuous culture, because we see the arrows there. There was only one migration that went into Australia. Okay? So the people are culturally distinct. They did not have contact until recently with others. Okay? And the journey also goes on to Asia, okay? Around 40,000 years ago, approximately, and then to Europe around 35 to 40,000 years ago. These migration routes are very simplistic. It is extremely, much more complex than what you see here. This is just to give an overview. From Asia, you had a population group break off and go into the Americas, but that happened only around 15,000 years ago or so. Okay? So that is the basic order of the major migration patterns before the age of discovery, before Columbus discovered the New World. Okay? And notice, in South America, you have one major migration going in there. And in North America, you see two of them entered in. So, North American native, or the native Americans from North America have more genetic diversity than the ones in South America. Okay, this is what this is alluding to. Okay. So, the picture of humanity is like this. Being cultivated in East Africa from 200,000 years up until maybe 50,000 years ago, and then expanding outward to the rest of the world. Okay. Modern humans who met Neanderthals inside Europe for that brief time period when their eras overlapped, there was some genetic exchange, certainly, okay, about 1 to 2 to 3 to 4%. Okay. Now, as humans migrated out of Africa, there were different evolutionary pressures on the population groups because of the different climates. Let me give a brief overview on the skin color advantages and disadvantages, okay, before moving forward here. Okay, so in this chart, okay, lighter skin in a low sunlight or UVR region, ultraviolet radiation region. So if you have light skin and it's a low sunlight region, such as Northern Europe or Northern Asia, vitamin D synthesis could occur. Vitamin D is very much essential. At this time, you couldn't really get it from a diet. You had to rely on sunlight going through your skin to make vitamin D. So if you have very light skin, where there's not so much sunlight, your skin allows sufficient amount of sunlight in. Okay? Darker skin won't allow so much sunlight in order for vitamin D synthesis to occur. And that results in vitamin D deficiency known as rickets. Okay? Folate retention, that is vitamin B. Okay? Folate retention happens with light-skinned people in light, or I should say low sunlight regions. The vitamin B is not violated. With darker skin, folate retention or vitamin B retention has no effect. But darker skin in a very low sunlight region risks vitamin D deficiency. Before you ask, well, how do darker skinned people live in various parts of the world where there is low sunlight? Well, now vitamin D is part of many foods. But back then, around 35,000 years ago, you had to obtain it through sunlight. Now it's a different game plan. Right? Now you can get vitamin D in milk and different types of foods. So it's become a non-issue today, but back then it was a big issue. In high sunlight regions, and if you have lighter skin, you still have vitamin D synthesis, but you're skin cancer prone, okay, because you don't have the melanin that's within the skin to help protect and block out the sunlight. Sunburn prone, and also folate destruction. Because the skin's being destroyed, you also destroy your vitamin D retention. Okay? And darker skin in high sunlight regions have an advantage because you still have vitamin D synthesis, even though a lot of sunlight is blocked out. A lot of it still enters. And you have folate retention. Okay? So it's not that skin cancer would be the factor to weed out anyone, because skin cancer takes a long time to occur. The key here is vitamin D deficiency. So when the Africans entered Europe, I'm talking about modern humans of Africa entering Europe, they took their dark skin, their height, and their slender build with them. How did the skin lighten? Well, those that didn't have the ability to have lighter skin, because again, skin color ranges even on an individual depending on the time of season. So those that had the ability to have their skin lightened were the ones that survived, and those that retained too much melanin and couldn't lighten their skin, those are the ones that got rickets. Okay? And when you get rickets, it starts at an early age and it's very debilitating. You cannot live long enough to reproduce. Okay, so those were weeded out of the population, and it explains why in Europe and in Asia the lighter skin was emphasized. Okay. Okay, so here's a worldwide distribution of skin color. Okay, the darker areas mean the darkest skins, and the lighter areas mean the lightest skins. Okay, we see that along the equator is where you have the darkest skins, as to be expected. And as you move away from the equator, you see a gradual lightening. Not an abrupt lightening of skin, mind you, gradually. Okay? In the Americas, you see that along the equator, the skin color is not so dark. Now, why is that? That's easily explained. You have the population in the Americas that are just around 15,000 years old. The ones in Africa and other parts of the world are at least 50,000 plus. So evolution had more time to take place in those regions compared to the Americas. But you see the tendency is along the equator for there to be darker skin, okay, all across the world. It's just in the Americas, we don't see it fully developed or caught up with the rest of the world because the population there is younger. Okay? And this map here is all pre-Columbian, before America was discovered, before the arrival of the Europeans. That's an important note to make. This is not the skin color distribution of the way the world looks now. Because of globalization, there's a lot of migrations and crisscross and full set of populations changing places where they once were. So this is about skin color distribution 500 years ago. Okay? So, when we think about the concept of race again, okay, where you have a distinguished or a distinct population within a species. Here, if you use skin color as the yardstick to try and figure out, you know, what groups can you clump together, the problem here is, where do you draw the line between what is light and what is dark? Because there is a gradual darkening as you go close to the equator, and as you go away from the equator, there's a gradual lightening. So there's no discrete way of drawing the line of who is actually dark or who is actually light-skinned. Okay? So that's a problem when using skin color as a way to classify races. So you can't do it, because if you go along the equator, you're linking populations that have been separated for a very long time and linking them together because they have a common skin color. So the people of equatorial Africa, southern India, Papua New Guinea and Australia, those are the darkest. You want to lump them together as one race, the dark race, the black race, however you want to, categorize that group. But you're linking together Africans and Australians that have been separated around 50,000 years ago. Okay, so that wouldn't make sense either. Okay, so skin color as a way to divide up humanity doesn't make sense because there's no real definite dividing line between light and dark in this case. Okay. Here are the Khoisan people, probably the people that are most related to the population that started out in Africa right before the migrations. Okay? So these people have presumably the most genetic diversity of humanity because they gave rise to all of humanity around the world, and this is a direct descendant of that group right before the migration. So you find all kinds of variety in the group of the Khoisan people. Okay? You can see variation in skin color. Okay? They come in lighter and darker. You can see the high cheekbones, which many people attribute to the Asian populations. All the characteristics are contained within them, right here. Okay, so the greatest genetic diversity exists among the Khoisan here. Okay? The Papua New Guineans, which are also aligned close to the equator and have been separated from the African population for about 40,000 years ago or so. So they do have the dark skin, that's because they're along the equator. Okay? But they built up their own culture and, of course, language. Because the one thing that migrations do is cultivate the development of a different culture and language and make the group identifiable and distinct in cultural terms from other groups. Okay? So that's the origin of having different cultures, is when you have different migrations and people are separated. The Maasai of East Africa. You can see they look very different from the Khoisan that I showed you. Okay? Again, it just speaks for the genetic diversity within Africa. Okay? And the Australian Aborigines. Okay? Also quite dark because of their position along the equator. But again, this population broke off from the main African one 50,000 years ago or so. Okay? As far as data tells us. Okay? And here are representative of the peoples of Europe, but I'm going to have a different purpose for the Amish, Mennonite, and Hutterites. Okay? Now, the reason why I chose the Amish, Mennonite, and Hutterites is because this would explain why in certain groups of people you find a high disproportionate amount of a certain genetic condition, for example, than compared to a larger population. Okay? Or compared to the larger United States population. Thousands of Amish, Mennonite, and Hutterites today descended from just a few hundred that arrived from Central Europe, German-speaking Central Europe, about 300 years ago to the United States, because of its, of religious persecution. The Amish, Mennonite, and Hutterites were Anabaptist, meaning they believed that baptism should occur as an adult, not as a child. And that caused great conflict with the Catholic Church. So they were persecuted and they left to go to North America to find their religious freedom and develop their own communities. However, you're talking about a few hundred individuals from the greater population of German-speaking Central Europe. And the gene distributions that they took with them, okay, they might have taken genes that weren't so prevalent in the main population, but because they were so small, it might have had a higher incidence within a small grouping. So this is kind of like a bottleneck, if you will, because you're taking a tiny sample of the main population and moving, and they're not going to be exactly alike as far as genetic distribution as the main ones. So they have a disproportionate amount of certain genetic conditions. Okay? However, the Amish seem to do well with not having a high incidence of cystic fibrosis, for example, that exists more so in the European/Caucasian population. So they didn't get that gene, but they got a whole slew of other genes. However, medical research has shown that a lot of the Amish can be helped. Clinics that moved into the area that promised not to change them or interfere with their culture and way of life have had tremendous progress in treating a lot of the genetic conditions that they had, where the individual doesn't have to worry about any type of adverse symptoms or as such. So this phenomenon where you take a smaller population from the main and use that as repopulating another area, that's called a founder effect. It's kind of like bottlenecking because you're starting off with just a narrow gene pool in what the original was. Okay? So that's why the Amish, as an example for ethnic diseases, that's how some ethnic diseases occur. They just happen to have broken off from a branch of people, and they took a lot of genes with them at a higher proportion than what the main population had. So there's nothing inherent about the Amish to have a certain condition. It's just the way the cards were drawn, basically. Okay? And this can be applied to many different genetic conditions that one attributes to, let's say, African Americans, to Caucasians, to Asians, to Native Americans, and so on. That's how it happened, because when the migrations happen, the genes are not always distributed equally. Okay? Further along regarding human variations, or why we are so different. So I just used the Amish as an example of how humans can be different from one another in terms of genetics. The evolution of lactose tolerance. So this is when lactose tolerance, meaning this is when you have the ability to digest milk and extract nutrients from milk and process it. Okay? Our human species was not lactose tolerant originally. Okay? Well, it still isn't overall. However, different pockets of human populations have built up lactose tolerance, meaning they can digest milk. So this is what happens when you are lactose tolerant. Okay? Behind me, you can see a chart, small intestine, large intestine. Okay? In the small intestine, if you don't have that ability to digest lactose, which is the nutrient inside milk, it won't get broken down. It's going to pass right through. But as it passes right through, the concentration within the small intestine is very high compared to outside of the intestinal wall. So water flows into the intestine to balance the solute concentration. But when you take in water inside the intestine, all this excess water just to balance out the solute, what you do is you make it easier to pass out the lactose, but it comes in the form of diarrhea. Okay? Those of you know if you're lactose tolerant or not. I'm positive about that. So what happened here is, in the human population, the normal human population, or I should say the ancestral, was normally you would be lactose tolerant for the first few years of life, so you can digest mother's milk. But then there's a genetic switch that turns it off, a regulatory gene. That shuts that ability off. Because as an adult, don't really need any more mother's milk. You move on to other foods. However, a mutation occurred in the human population that prevented that switch to be shut off. Okay? The switch was broken that shut off the ability to digest milk. So into adulthood, you could digest milk. Not of consequence, but what that mutation did was, in a culture where you had a dairy culture, for instance, a lot of cows and so on, in times of drought, milk became a good source of nutrients, and those people were able to survive drought periods more so than those that were lactose intolerant. So in Europe today, after many generations, you have 90 or plus % lactose tolerance in Europe. Also in parts of Africa where there was a dairy culture, you also had a high percentage of lactose tolerance as well. In Taiwan today, for instance, hardly anyone is lactose tolerant. So you probably can't find milk to save your life there, for instance. Okay? So most of humanity is still lactose intolerant. But Europeans today, all of them are lactose tolerant, and it has nothing to do with them being something special. It's just that's the way the evolutionary trajectory took hold. Okay? Immunity against infectious diseases. This is another way of revealing what human diversity we have. The bubonic plague, or Black Death, okay, happened in the Middle Ages. It happened during the Middle Ages in Europe. So this disease, whoever caught it, it was running through the sewer system because the cities were just growing so fast. The sewer system did not keep up. And I guess we're still having that problem today, as you can tell with the smell. So that's what caused the plague to occur. Okay? So the plague wiped out a large portion of the European population. And medieval medicine was not good. You were better off not having a doctor there at the time, because what they did was they practiced bloodletting. They would poke a needle inside of you to let out the bad blood, okay, in order to help you. But what that did is you bled to death, right? So so if you were lucky, you had relatives that just put you on a bed and wait. A lot of Europeans died. Okay? But there was a few that survived, not because of medieval medicine, because there was just something within their bodies that prevented them from dying. A stronger immune system, highly likely. Again, those were just a few individuals that had that. Okay? Because, again, individual to individual varies. And some individuals did better with bubonic plague than others. So a few Europeans did survive. And those that survived continued with life, had children, and those children had other children, okay? And those strong genes for immunity was also passed on. This time in a higher proportion than previously, because you weeded out a lot of Europeans that had weaker immune systems, okay? So the European population, at the age of discovery, 200 years later, okay, during Columbus's time, they went to the New World with their strong immunity. They did not know they had strong immunities, okay? They went there, and many Native Americans were becoming sick simply because the Europeans carried diseases that didn't harm them anymore, but it would harm the Native Americans because they did not have a history of filth. Okay, let's just put it that way. The Native Americans lived a different way. The population was a lot smaller, and they had vast, expanse of land. So they didn't have that same bottleneck effect that the Europeans had. Okay, so the Native Americans were much like Europe was before the Black Plague. Okay, you can put it, state that analogy. So Europe didn't conquer, quote unquote, the Americas because of their superior weapons or anything like that. The Native Americans had the numbers. It's that the disease really decimated the Native American population and really, made their, really messed up their culture and their practices and their organization and so on. So that's why New World populations, not having been exposed to that same kind of environment, were not doing well during the arrivals of the Europeans. So it wasn't something that the Europeans had that was better than Native Americans, it's just that's how their evolutionary trajectory went. Okay. So let's look at, besides the skin color, okay, where I showed there's no clear-cut distinctions among peoples of the world, let's take the blood group gene distribution as well, since we're all familiar with blood groups, because it's used in medicine so much. I think every one of you has heard of blood group and probably even know your own blood group. Okay? Now there's one gene that controls blood group, and that gene could either be an A, a B, or an O. Okay? So here I have the version of the gene called A. Okay? And the darker green represents where there is more percentage of the gene for A. We can see in Western Europe, it's darker green. In Australia, it's a darker green. But both these populations have been separated for 50,000 years or so. In Africa, we see moderate green. In Asia, also moderate green. In South America, nothing. Okay? In North America, you see some green. Again, South America is less genetically diverse than North. Okay? In pre-Columbian times, I might add. So, is this a way to divide up humanity? Does blood grouping give us a way to divide up humanity? Do we separate the South Americans from the rest? No one would do that because the South Americans are related to the North Americans, genetically speaking. Very closely related. So, this doesn't give us a clear-cut way to divide up humanity. Okay? The difference between the populations here is they just vary in accordance to the percentage of A's. Some have lower and some have higher A's, but it's pretty much distributed everywhere except in South America. Okay. Let's take the gene for B. Okay. We see South America doesn't have it, North America doesn't have it, but we see a high incidence of it in Asia. It exists in Europe in lower frequencies, and in parts of Africa it also varies. Okay? So the difference between populations is simply the frequency of how often the gene occurs. Okay? So humans are not distinct genetically in that, for this reason. Okay? What we do have here are clines. Okay? Clines is a biological term where the differences between population are not that one group has these set of genes and the other group has this set of genes, and they don't share, and the two groups don't share any genes with each other. What we have here is clines, okay, where you have different frequencies of the same gene between populations. So Asia has a higher incidence of blood group B, let's say, and Europe a lower incidence, but the Europeans still have a little bit of blood group B nonetheless. So you see, that's the only difference between the two population groups. Nothing's so distinct because there is overlap, you see. Okay, so moving a step further in this whole argument about race, it doesn't have a biological reality. Okay? Remember, people have used the term race for their own political agendas here. So what race is she? This was a very recent current event about Rachel Dolezal, former president of the Spokane, Washington NAACP. Okay? She voluntarily stepped down as president because it was revealed that she wasn't a true African American, sort of speak, quote unquote. Okay? The photo on your left side, that is her before she broke away from her family. And then the photo on the right was when she was already broken away from her family and started a new life. She did marry an African American, did have a child, did identify with African American people, culture, and so on, and became a major advocate for African Americans. However, she was exposed by her parents with that photo on the left, showing that, no, this is our daughter, this is who she really is. So then this stirs a debate. Yes, okay, she lied or misled, but did she really lie? Well, it's been found out that she does have European ancestry, of course, some Native American as well, but there was no African ancestry found whatsoever. She didn't have the genetic markers linking her to a recent relationship with the people of Africa. Okay? We are all originally from Africa, of course, but there was no recent genetic link towards there. So, was she lying? Or what is the problem with someone advocating and identifying themselves with a certain group of people by choice? I think a lot of people were upset at her because she was lying or misleading. The fact that she stated that this African-American man was her father, so that was basically, bold-faced lie there. She, probably this is a symptom of just her breaking away from her family. That could have been it. But nonetheless, the history of the United States states that, if you have just one ancestor from Africa, you are African-American. The one-drop rule. I mean, that's the heritage of the United States. And this is not shared anywhere else, or I should say, in a lot of other places in the world, this is not shared. But over here, in this country, the one-drop rule applies, in a social context. So in her case, yeah, she didn't have the one drop of African ancestry, but she identified with the people. There is no race concept, biologically speaking. We just have different human cultures, and she identifies with the culture of the African Americans. Who's to stop that? Just something to contemplate regarding our obsession with this race concept. In context here, Kennewick man, so named because he was discovered in Kennewick, Washington. Okay, it's an 8,500-year-old human that stirred up a lot of controversy regarding as to what quote-unquote origins he had. The early identity ranged from being Polynesian to European to Native American and to Ainu, okay, which is a group of people in Japan. So if race was a concrete concept, they wouldn't have had this much difficulty in finding out, what this, what these remains were more closely related to, or if race was an actual viable concept, there wouldn't have been this controversy. One just takes their measurements and be done with it. But again, because of overlapping features across the world, this wasn't the case. DNA analysis, however, reveals a very close relationship with the Native Americans. So they were relatives. So that's what DNA helps us with. We can determine who you are more related to, but you can't do anything with the physical features of an individual. Okay? So Africans who can pass as white. These two are celebrities, actors. They're well known, and their ancestry, therefore, is also well known. They both had a parent that many of us would describe as African origin, or at least having a lot of African ancestry. However, these two individuals could easily pass as white in current society, within the general public. However, in the United States, with that social construct of that one-drop rule, they're considered African American. Now, this brings up another question. Would you even think twice about considering them African American? What if on the census data, they identified as African? It wouldn't be wrong, or would it? Again, our obsession with race brings up these debates. Okay? Race on the US Census here. Okay? So, to the left, I have the entire census form, but I highlighted items 8 and 9 to my right. Okay? Let's look at number 8. Is person one of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? So they're lumping Spanish with Hispanic and Latino. But then they have on number 9, white, black, African, and then American Indian, okay? All these other groupings. Now, putting Spanish separate. Okay. Now, putting Spanish separate, apart from the white, it's because of the history of Great Britain and the United States, the animosity. During the Age of Discovery, Spain and Great Britain weren't exactly friends. So that's why you have this differentiation, or this putting Spanish as separate from European, for instance. Okay? So what I'm getting here is the US Census is subjective, and it only applies to really this country. In Brazil, when they hear about the one-drop rule, they would think we're crazy, because they would never do that. They would consider those two celebrities that I pictured to you guys, they would consider that they're white. The Brazilians don't have this one-drop rule. It's how you look like that matters, for instance. And in South Africa, they have yet even other categories. where they take their census. So there is no universal category to use, which basically debunks the whole race concept if no one could really agree on how the categories exist, because the categories don't really present themselves in a clear-cut manner. Okay, it's very subjective. Okay, so concluding remarks. All humans are about 99.9% genetically identical to one another, and the largest difference exists between male and female. Okay? Differences between individual humans manifest themselves in our DNA, so potentially each human could be their own race. Are we going to go that far? As far as genetic distinction, have each human their own race? No, no one would do that. But we do have different DNAs, all of us, except for identical twins. Infrared imaging also distinguishes us as individuals. So do our lip prints, retinal scans too, dental patterns, even that can distinguish one individual from another, and also fingerprints. Okay, even identical twins do not have identical fingerprints. Identical twins would only share the same DNA, but then you can rely on other factors to distinguish one individual from the other. So that is humanity. We are distinct and unique, but the biological concept of race doesn't exist within us because of migration patterns, because we are a very young species. Okay, the only way you would have hello? Oh, battery died away. Too much talking. Okay. So the only way you would have race is, or biological race is, if you had isolated populations for a very long time. But humans don't allow themselves to be isolated for long. So globalization prevents that. If we were to send a colony up to Mars, okay, and never have anything to do with that population again, for sure, within several thousand years, 100,000 years, they would become genetically different than us because of the normal rate of mutations that take place within a population. That gives enough time to have genetic distinctiveness between two populations, the one in Earth and the one in Mars. Okay? But we don't do well as far as isolating any population. You know, constant migration patterns prevent that from happening.